Thank you, thank you. It is a huge pleasure to be able to do this with somebody I admire enormously. Raj is one of the most brilliant and talented people I've met, but also one of the most optimistic, down-to-earth, straightforward. The first time I heard about you was Bill Gates telling me, you got to meet this guy. He's super smart. And when Bill Gates tells you somebody's super smart, you kind of figure you probably should meet him. Let me do this, Raj. Before we get into the book and your story, let's deal with the elephant in the room. When you look at something like what is going on in the Middle East right now, given the background you have, you ran USAID, you worked at the largest foundation in the world, how do you think of it when you see it?
Yeah, well, Fareed, first, thank you for doing this, and thank you all for being here and streaming around the country. I'm really excited about this conversation, and thank you for that generous introduction, which I will have to go back and remind Bill that he might have at some point in a moment of weakness said that. When I ran USAID, we had very significant humanitarian efforts in Gaza, and we had significant financial support for the Palestinian Authority coordinated through Israel. You know, it was Israel's priority to ensure that there was enough stability there that it protected their national security. And I think when we saw what happened, it is a tragic, horrific terrorist attack that should be unequivocally condemned and appropriately has been, and it just shatters hope in some sense. But I think about this as I think about many of the conflict environments we worked in over a long period of time, which is it is in Israel's and America's national security interest to take a 3D approach: defense, diplomacy, and development and humanitarian affairs. And so there should be a strong, powerful, unequivocally successful defense response, and you're seeing that play out. At the same time, there absolutely has to be, and you've written about this and spoken about it, a broader diplomatic strategy that recognizes that maybe this isn't exactly what it appears. There might be a bigger game here with Iran, with other proxies of Iran, with efforts to derail kind of long-term security by derailing the Saudi deal. And so there should be a concerted diplomatic effort that the United States backs completely. And finally, development humanitarian considerations are going to be important. Not maybe, I believe you shouldn't have red lines on day one, and it's wrong to establish those and force them on others, but it would be in Israel's long-term and medium-term security interest to ensure that it remains on the side of right in the eyes of so many critical stakeholders to Israel's long-term security. And I have been part of many humanitarian activities where communities are sieged, and you see how the public opinion changes very quickly, and that then changes the reality of the battlefield, and that then changes the reality of the security situation. So I think America should be standing with Israel across all three of those dimensions right now. I suspect that is happening. Some of it's very visible, some of it's very private, and that's appropriate, but it's important to take all three elements into consideration.
It does feel as though the first is all overwhelming right now, and understandably, given what Israel went through, as you say. It was one of the most barbaric terror attacks we've seen in history, as far as I can tell. But now the response, the UN is talking about this as being, a humanitarian catastrophe, collective punishment. Do you think that, it's going to be so difficult to destroy Hamas without, first of all, I'm not sure what it means to destroy Hamas, because it will be difficult since they have planned this. They will have gone underground already, but difficult to do it without enormous collateral damage. And how do you strike that balance?
Well, I think less about striking a balance and more about offering solutions. And, you know, the book hopefully is about solutions to tough problems. We've seen in other settings, humanitarian evacuations, humanitarian corridors. We've seen, even in some conflict settings, specific humanitarian pauses, even for a day or two, to protect certain populations and evacuate them. And I suspect, I don't know this, but I suspect a lot of different tools that have been used in other situations are being and ought to be considered. I don't think, you know, when I was running USAID and I think this has been consistent for probably 8 or 9 years, you know, a good quarter of the population of Gaza was already receiving humanitarian assistance. A lot of partners, of course, there are Americans on the ground and dealing with their life and their evacuation is critical, but Mercy Corps, World Food Program, these are long-standing institutions that have been supporting refugee communities and more broadly in that area. And of course, right now, there's nowhere for people to go in the spirit of an evacuation. So it is complicated, you know, rightly so. There's a lot of fear, anger, hurt, and there's a lot of appropriate, aggressive defense activity that we'll continue to see unfold over days, but there needs to be a serious humanitarian track that's putting other options on the table and seeing if there's space for that.
Why is Gaza such a bleak place? When UN Secretary General Guterres went there, he came out of it and said, "I think I've just been to hell on earth." What is it about Gaza? I know it's the most densely populated place in the world, but you know, I don't mean to be flippant, but Hong Kong is also densely populated. That alone does not explain. What do you think makes it so desperate? Because the reason I ask is because I worry that in a place like that where people's lives are so wretched, and then they're going to go through this period, you know, the bombings, and when people have absolutely no hope, I do think it makes it easier to turn to terrorism.
Well, there's no question long-term peace, stability, and prosperity must be based on the simple reality that everyone, everywhere should have dignity and hope. That's what our country is founded on, and we're imperfect in living up to that credo. And when I was at USAID, it was easy to see how if you don't offer communities anywhere in the world dignity and hope, you can't expect stability, peace, and prosperity. And the hard part is showing folks that there's a path there, which is sort of why I wrote the book, to say, look, you might think it's not possible to solve hunger, but we actually think there's some solutions that could work at scale, and they've been proven to do so. You might think it's impossible to bring electricity to communities that have no power and live in the dark, and as a result are stuck in this extreme poverty trap. We're showing the world how to do that at scale. I think when I was in the West Bank, you know, you would see young entrepreneurs that were part of these Google entrepreneurship programs that USAID would run with others, and there was a spark of hope there that you just didn't see in Gaza. And I think it was a locked-in siege mentality, a refugee-dominant environment where people feel like they're temporary, but everybody knows they're not. And that's restoring hope for everybody is really what the book is about. And but I think right now in the short term, we're going to see what we're going to see, and it's going to be a strong and unequivocal defense response.
All right, let's get to it. And by the way, if people have questions, you know the way the why works. You can write them down, and we'll get back to this part of the conversation if you'd like. But let me get to the book. And what I want to start at is your story. So, you know, you strike me as the kind of poster child for Indian American overachievement. You couldn't decide whether to become a doctor or get a PhD, so you decided to do both. You have a doctorate in economics, a medical degree. Take us through what were you thinking? Why were you trying to get the Nobel Prize in continuing graduate studies?
All right, no Nobel Prizes here. I grew up, as you know, in a predominantly Indian American family, and I grew up in suburban Detroit. My parents are immigrants from India. They came in the late 60s, 70s. They took a big risk, right? They left a country they knew, communities they were comfortable in. They came to a place where they didn't know anybody, had no resources, but they had educational scholarships and an education, and they were prepared to build a better life. And I think maybe as a result of that, so many people who lived that had this perspective that their kids shouldn't have to take those risks. Their kids, you know, if you're smart enough, you should be a doctor. I kind of heard that basically from day one. And
were your parents doctors?
My dad was an engineer at Ford Motor Company for more than 30 years, and I grew up in Detroit. You know, if you're even in public middle school, you start taking engineering and pre-engineering drafting and sketching cars and all that stuff. So I wanted to be an auto designer when I was young. And my mother was a Montessori school teacher and then ran her own school. But anyway, I went on to try that. It wasn't until, you know, a couple of trips to India as a kid and seeing, I had uncles and aunts that lived very comfortably and had a lot of prosperity, but they insisted on taking my sister and I into these slums outside of Mumbai. And I remember one of those visits, we were quite young, but we'd go and walk and see the kids playing, smiling, happy kids, but playing in open sewers and open sewage, and you just thought, how are people living this way? And then years later in Detroit, I had this moment when President Mandela, at the time not president, Nelson Mandela, when he was released from prison after 27 years, came of all places to Detroit, Michigan. You know, and in New York, you're used to it because New Yorkers get to see everybody. In Detroit, that wasn't our experience. And so he came to the River Rouge plant, which is this famous Ford Motor Company plant where vertical integration was sort of perfected, and then spoke at Tiger Stadium at a quintessential Motown. He was introduced by Stevie Wonder performing. It was just amazing. But he closed all of his speeches with the same refrain, and he would say, to the people of Detroit, from the people of South Africa, I want to say, we respect you, we admire you, and we love you. And I was just blown away by just the whole moment. And I said, okay, I want to do something different with my life, but I actually didn't have any idea what that meant. So I went to med school, became a doctor, and somewhere near the end of that process, I had the chance to work for Al Gore on his presidential campaign. So I left medicine, actually applied 3 times just to be a volunteer on this campaign, got rejected all 3 times. Then, for those of you that remember, he actually moved his campaign from Washington to Nashville because it wasn't going well based in Washington. And someone called and said, you might want to try one more time. And I did, and they said, we'd love to have you. So the day after my board exams, my then girlfriend, now wife, Shivam, and I got in the car, drove 14 hours from Philadelphia to Nashville, Tennessee. I spent 6 months living in Al Gore's best friend's mom's pool house. And I started at the bottom of the totem pole. I was driving high school kids to the Nashville Public Library to copy on microfiche stories about Al Gore's war against lawn darts in the 1970s. But that was my start in politics.
And so how did you go from there to a PhD in economics?
Well, I actually got a master's, but I did that before while I was in Penn.
So then you go from the Gore campaign to?
Well, it turns out, as you might recall, we didn't win that campaign, even though we thought we did. That's a whole different story. I actually take some pride. We're at the War Memorial.
You should have gone to law school.
Well, I should have, in fact, because I was at the War Memorial that night, and when Ron Klain, who was kind of the leader of our group, we were the policy and research team, said to our team, oh, you guys all have to go back because there's some irregularities in Florida, and we need to interview people in the middle of the night, and this and that. And I said, no, we're not going back. We lost. We've missed every major moment of this campaign. We're just going to sit out here in the rain and appreciate this closing moment. And a few of my friends, who now you would know all their names, but they sort of were like, that's a good idea. About 5 minutes later, Ron called back and was like, get in the office. So we all went back. But anyway, we lost. I was out of work. One thing led to another, and I ended up working for Bill and Melinda Gates right when they were starting their foundation.
And in a way, you know, I'm guessing that some of the book comes from that experience, because one of the things that I was very struck by about the Gates Foundation was people forget now, but how really kind of radical it was. There were two things I found radical about it. One was that they really said, we are going to put money where you can save the largest number of lives in order to have the biggest bang for the buck in saving human lives and bettering human lives, regardless of the passport of the person we're saving, regardless of the nationality. Very, very rare for anybody to view it in those terms. They did carve out, I think a little bit later, partly because they got criticized, a certain amount for American education. But the fundamental theory was always, we're sort of going to treat everybody as, as equal in God's eyes. And the second was, we're going to make big bets. We're not going to do the usual philanthropy thing of giving. Was that part of how you began to think about it this way?
Entirely. In fact, you said it brilliantly, and I credit entirely the way of thinking with what I learned in those formidable years working with Bill and Melinda. I mean, they read a New York Times article that said that there were 600,000 kids every year that died of rotavirus, and we've all had rotavirus, but we are obviously here. Kids in the United States don't die of rotavirus, but malnourished children in lower income countries do. And the article went on to say, well, there's a new vaccine coming on to the market, but it's only going to be available in the US and maybe Europe, and it's not going to be available where the kids are dying. And they just said, well, that seems wrong. And it led to this exploration of what's the most effective way to save kids' lives. The answer to that on a quantitative basis is vaccine-preventable disease and investing in immunizations. And what do we have to do to vaccinate every child on the planet? And at the time, there were about 104 million kids born every year. Probably about 60 to 70 million were getting vaccines. And the rest were in a lot of developing countries. Were not only not getting vaccines, there wasn't even an industrial supply base that existed to manufacture low-cost vaccines at scale. And so we spent years just studying. The first chapter of the book is called Ask a Simple Question, because Bill would constantly bring everyone into a conference room and say, what does it cost to vaccinate a child, and and then multiply that by 104 million, play it out over 20 years, and let's go raise that resource to do that effectively. And that way of thinking about a really big bet, ending vaccine-preventable disease, taking the number of kids under 5 who are dying from 11, 12 million a year to well under 5 million a year, was intoxicating. It was fun, it was exciting, and it was intellectually challenging as well.
What was the most fun part about working for Bill Gates?
Well, I grew up, my favorite kind of childhood activity in school was called policy debate, for those who do that. And it's it's a form of argumentation, and it's just so much fun. And with Bill, you get to constantly debate. Like he asks a question, you give an answer, he tells you you're wrong, and you either leave or you stay and fight. And I was a stay and fight kid, so I really loved it. And the second chapter of the book is about when we realized we had to restructure the global vaccine industry. And that would require a different type of financing, front-loaded investment and long-term contracts and picking winners and all of that. We invented something with a lot of help from others called I call them immunization bonds, but I think of it as the world's first big social impact bond. And I wrote a memo to Bill to kind of propose it, and I met him actually in New York in his suite at the Pierre. And it was my first big one-on-one sparring session with Bill. And so I was prepared, and I went into his suite, and he pulls out the paper, and it's got red ink all over it. And he's like, this is a really bad idea. And he said that in a much more colorful way, much more, and proceeded to just go after it. And we had a good hour or 90-minute debate over that. And he was highly critical, but in being critical, he sort of gave us a roadmap of problems we needed to solve. We spent the next 3-4 years kind of really working on it. Ultimately, we launched the International Finance Facility for Immunization, raised $6 billion at the time, used it to provide these long-term vaccine contracts with Serum Institute of India and others that became the world's large-scale, low-cost supply base. And 20 years later, 980 million kids vaccinated and 16 million lives saved. And so my favorite part of that, thank you. My favorite part of that was just the back and forth, you know.
Did he ever, I think I know the answer to this, knowing him somewhat, did he ever tell you, hey, Raj, you know, it turned out that was a good idea?
Not quite in those terms. A mutual friend of ours, I think, has a dollar bill where he signed it and said, I was wrong, Bill. I've been asking for that dollar bill for a long time.
I have had a similar situation where we had begun a very spirited debate, and the next day, I mean, he completely did not concede that I was right. I sent him an academic article. I still remember this bizarrely. This is 20 years ago. Jeff Sachs, when he was wrote an article in American Economic Review, and I sent it to him. And 3 days later, I got a one-word response: interesting. So you go from Gates to this, you know, really extraordinary. We'll talk about USAID, but I want you to tell us the moment that Hillary Clinton, Secretary of State, under Barack Obama, calls you, and you tell. What was your reaction?
Well, so I started in the Obama administration in the Department of Agriculture for a short window of time. And one morning, I was in my office, and my BlackBerry, that's what we had then, rang. And it was Hillary, and she said, Raj, I've talked to the president, and we want you to run the U.S. Agency for International Development. And I was blown away. I mean, first I thought someone was pretending to be Hillary, because she started with, hey, Raj, it's Hillary. And I was like, sure, you know. And then I realized, you know, she was serious. And I was blown away. I mean, I was excited by the opportunity. USAID has been really the world's most significant global development and humanitarian platform for a very long time.
How much money does it give out?
Now probably north of $30 billion a year. At the time it was 25 billion a year. And even more important than the money was when, you know, was just the history. Like it was USAID that brought, in partnership with South Korea, created a modern economy where we have more jobs trading with South Korea than we do France today. And I could tell that story across so many different places. USAID helped invent oral rehydration solutions, saved 11 million lives, and powered the Green Revolution together with the Rockefeller Foundation, the Ford Foundation, that helped move 1 billion people off the brink of hunger in the 60s and 70s and early 80s. So it's this really amazing legacy place to be a part of. And so I was just eager. At first I thought I'd get in a little bit of trouble with my current boss, Tom Vilsack, who was the Secretary of Agriculture, and then I realized the president takes care of that part for you.
Right. You know, I do think most Americans don't know enough and don't take enough pride in what you were saying. The amazing success, the amazing contribution that the United States government, taxpayer dollars, have had in, you know, ending disease, curing diseases, helping children malnutrition, spurring economic growth, and I've often wondered why, because, you know, there's a tendency not to tell this story because you want the locals to be able to take the lion's share of the credit, but it does have this perverse effect that in America, people either don't think of it at all or think that we spend, you know, 20 times as much on foreign aid as we actually do, and think it's all wasted and inefficient and corrupt.
Well, that's actually exactly the percentage. If you ask Americans, the One campaign, which Bono helped create, has done these surveys, and they'll ask Americans across the country, how much do you think we spend on foreign aid? Answer is always 20%. I don't know why it's always 20%. It's never 10, it's never 50, it's always 20%. And the real answer, of course, is less than 1%. And then if you say, well, if for less than 1% of our federal budget, we're getting outcomes like 25 million people on antiretrovirals and really saving the labor force and so many lives across Africa, thanks to George W. Bush and a bipartisan effort to create PEPFAR to fight HIV/AIDS, efforts that brought malaria deaths down from 1.1 million kids per year to under 500,000 kids per year. Again, the President's Malaria Initiative, which USAID ran. these huge efforts to address hunger and poverty. People don't even realize this, but even famines, like you remember the 1984 famine in Ethiopia. Today, we still have famines, but we don't lose as much life at all because the science of responding to a famine, targeted feeding, measuring arm to height circumference and ratios, the ability to use these new ready-to-use therapeutic foods that can resuscitate kids that are truly on their deathbeds from malnutrition and hunger in a crisis environment is just extraordinary. And I've seen it in Somalia, I've seen it in Afghanistan, I've seen it in Eastern Congo. It's amazing. And in every place we work in that capacity, we're actually bringing the very best of American values to really, really tough situations. And the way people react to that is unbelievable, just unbelievable. You know, we had a trip with President Obama to Tanzania once, and our visit was just after President Xi had been through. So President Xi came, did something, they signed a deal, built a new airport. 2 weeks later, signed a deal to build a new airport. 2 weeks later, we show up, and we get off Air Force One, we get in the motorcade. The entire way from the airport to the presidential palace, I mean, we were afraid people would get hurt. They were like 6, 7 deep on either side for miles to greet the motorcade. American flags everywhere, because people there appreciate that we save lives, that we create opportunity, that we build out energy infrastructure, and that we offer upward mobility. And frankly, because people want to touch the magic of the American dream as much as my grandfather did when he spent, you know, his retirement account buying a one-way ticket for my dad to come here. It's a universal thing, and we don't tap into it enough around the world.
Do you think when you were doing the USAID, when you began the USAID job, did you feel as though you had the flexibility to place these kind of big bets because it's a big bureaucracy, it's part of the State Department, sort of? How did you tackle that problem?
Yeah, absolutely not. There are only two ways we had that flexibility. The first were big, kind of either moral moments or immense, publicly visible disasters. A Haiti earthquake where 250,000 people perish 2 hours from our shores. Ebola pandemic where we worry about 1.6 million cases coming into the United States when Ebola, which is a hemorrhagic fever, had a 70+% mortality rate. I mean, think about that, because we all just lived through COVID with less than 1% mortality rate. So, during those moments, I saw government and politics come together to make extraordinary big bets that really changed the course of history from a humanitarian and fighting disease perspective.
And what would happen at those moments? Somehow, how would I just want to understand it mechanically. All those other, form filling and you have to get everything done approved by 20 departments is just all waived?
The mindset changes. And I saw this, my first week on the job was the Haiti earthquake. When it happened, President Obama called, again, my BlackBerry, and they're like, the White House is going to call. And I had very few colleagues because I'd just been appointed. And he called and says, Raj, here's what's happened. We're going to ask you and USAID to lead this whole of government response, including the military. Make us proud. And then the line went dead. And I thought I'd hung up, and I looked, and I was like, oh my gosh, I just hung up on the president. Actually, he had said enough and moved on. And 30 seconds later, he was on TV from the press room saying, this is a tremendous moment, moral moment in our foreign policy. We're going to show what American power used for good can do. And I've instructed Rajiv Shah to do this, 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 and this. Like deploy the Coast Guard, send the military assets, send the hospital ship, and all of that. And so I say that because
Can I interrupt you for 1 second? There was an Oval Office meeting where you overhear Joe Biden saying to Obama as you're walking in, is he really the right guy to be leading this effort? Isn't he a little inexperienced?
Well, so I was inexperienced, just to be clear. So the next morning, so that night, that's what happened. The next morning, we have a meeting in the Oval Office. I, of course, wanting not to be late, get there a few minutes early. And everyone's in this meeting. Janet Napolitano was our Homeland Security Secretary, and Coast Guard reported into her, and Craig Fugate ran FEMA. He was there. Hillary was coming as well from state. But I was early. So they let me in a few minutes early, and Biden and Obama are kind of off in the corner talking. And I literally heard Biden lean over and be like, "Are you sure about this guy, Raj Shah? He's like 30-something. He just got here. Don't you want to use," he was advocating for Craig Fugate, who's amazing, amazing guy. And President Obama saw me out of the corner of his eye, and he just came right over. He's like, "Raj, come on in, sit down." But I was like, "Oh my gosh!" But this is the point about disasters and moral moments like that. Craig was in that meeting. On the way out, Craig and I spoke, and I said, "Craig, I really need your help. Like, you've done this a million times. I have not." And he said, "You know what? I have myself and 3 people are going to just come and live out of your emergency operations center, and we're going to help with just absolutely anything you need." At the time, Mike Mullen was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He reached out and said, "We haven't met yet, but I'm at your disposal. Absolutely anything you need. And more so, I'm sending you a team so you know how to ask for things in the DoD system." The first night, we had to get C-130s off the ground to get these urban search and rescue teams into Port-au-Prince.
Big transport planes.
Big transport planes, but the runway was all broken up. So it was questionable about their landing capacity and their safety. And basically, to get DoD in America to give you a C-130 to take search and rescue teams with the dogs and the firefighters and all that actually takes about 100 pieces of paper. And I just said, "I don't even know how to do this paperwork," but I called Michelle Flournoy at the time and I said, "Michelle, we just got to get this done." And she's like, "We'll just do it verbally." And she recorded that we asked for 2 planes, and 2 planes went into the air. So I feel like and by the way, even at USAID, from Uganda and Afghanistan and Peru, our best people called me up and said, "You've never met me, but you need me right now. I'm on the next flight." And they just showed up. And I've just never seen anything like it. And so what we did at USAID, and the chapter in the book on this is called Open the Turnstiles, we literally convinced security to keep the turnstiles open so all these folks from all these other agencies could come in and out and feel like they were actually part of the team, fully vested in one team working together to deliver this result. But it gave me immense hope that if during this kind of a crisis, when people knew we were saving lives every moment, they could do these extraordinary things, that maybe we could convey that same spirit after the disaster goes away.
And that's another thing that I got reading the book, which is we forget that, there's a tendency, particularly in Washington, to think of the federal government as just, this bloated, inefficient. All these people are unionized. The private sector, the tech guys are the ones we hold up. But really, it is quite extraordinary, some of the people who work for the government. And not even, the most extraordinary, actually, not the people in Washington. They're the people at USAID working in insane conditions in Africa, really doing God's work out there for little pay, no glory. You saw a lot of that.
I did. There's a part in the book where I talk about some of our work in Eastern Congo. And right now, the Rockefeller Foundation just announced a big effort to bring electricity to the Eastern Congo. But, we had folks that would sit there, work with UNICEF and some other partners, but they would literally rehabilitate boys and girls who had been abducted by the LRA and into the different points of conflict. And some of these boys had been drugged, and they were child soldiers, and they were recovering their basic humanity in these centers. These girls had been treated and subjected to such unspeakable violence, and they were being supported, protected, given a second chance to experience life and dignity. And they do this without any real, unfortunately, the cameras never get there. You do it from time to time because you have a unique ability to kind of speak to the world about what really matters. But most modern media isn't looking for a success story of rehabilitating kids whose basic humanity has been robbed from them. And we had people on the ground doing this. And we do this on behalf of America and on behalf of American values. And now, for me to know that our teams at the Rockefeller Foundation are able to bring solar electrification to, over time, 7.1 million people in the Eastern Congo, to me is a transformation that is as important as the green revolution of the past or the fighting of Ebola or COVID as major pandemics.
So you leave government, and now you're at Rockefeller, and this gets us to the kind of philosophy that you have employed at Rockefeller, which is really the heart of the book. So talk about what are big bets?
Well, so big bets are efforts to really quite dramatically solve big, difficult human problems, and to avoid the sentiment that because we're doing good, doing a little bit of charitable work is good enough. So if you're trying to tackle electricity, for example, there are 1 billion people that live without real access to meaningful power and electricity. Our big bet is to reach 1 billion people with renewable electrification. And we started this a decade ago, and we'll stick with it for 3-4 decades if we have to, and we will have to. But it is looking for those fresh, innovative solutions, battery storage, new generation technology, trying to piece it all together in business models that are scalable and commercial. It's finding unlikely partners. That's a big part of big bets, and it's, in our case, the unlikely partners are big power companies. Tata Power in India is our biggest commercial partner. They're building out 10,000 rural mini-grids to reach 25 million people that don't have electricity, based on a model that Rockefeller helped pioneer with other commercial partners, and ultimately kind of fiercely measuring results. I mean, this was what I took away from the Gates days. It's like, if you're not measuring quantitative data, you have no way of knowing if you're on or off course. So we know today our energy program is probably reaching just over 10 million people in about 20 countries. We know the trajectory, and it'll accelerate over time, and we will get to 1 billion people because we'll embrace the new technologies and we'll give countries and communities access to technologies they wouldn't otherwise have. But that's what big bets are. They're about really saying, let's not just hand out solar lanterns in some community that doesn't have lighting. Let's actually put a structured solution in place that can provide productive electrification to 1 billion people that live in the dark.
So one of the questions here, since we got to this, is asked very simply, what is the realistic way to solve the problem of climate change? So small question.
Small question. Well, climate change is super interesting because people don't, I think, appreciate that this thing about tracking the temperature numbers is a little less precise than we pretend it is. It turns out we're blowing past all the ecosystem markers. So just this summer, a lot of attention was provided appropriately to Antarctica losing enough ice to be the size of Alaska and Texas put together. And that's an irreversible change that has long-term consequences for ocean temperatures, for fisheries, for access to protein for 1.5 billion people that depend on fisheries for protein and are vulnerable. So we're hurtling towards this sort of changed climate. And the reality is now that the US, Europe, and China have made big public investments in greening their economies, it's probably true that the worst outcomes, like human planetary extinction, are going to be avoided. But the UN is about to come out with this analysis that says we're going to end up somewhere between 2.5 and 3 degrees Celsius unless we do something different in terms of warming. That'll come out at the COP in about a month. And at that level, we will have 1.4 billion people be hungry instead of 700 million. We'll have 200 million climate refugees in the most conflict-sensitive parts of the world. We'll have, as I noted, as many as 2 billion people additional be malnourished because their protein sources will be deeply, deeply stressed. So in that environment, to me, the way to solve it fundamentally is to recognize that there are actually about 80, 81 countries in the world that are not able to make the kind of investments the US, Europe, and China are making. 50 of those countries are right now in a debt crisis. It was just in Kenya, 68 cents of the public dollar is going to repay debt. In Ghana, it's 72 cents. And then we turn around and ask these countries to wean off of coal and heavy fuel oil and diesel and invest in renewables. And they don't have the fiscal space to do any of the things we're doing in the wealthier parts of the world. So to me, accelerating the climate transition is about helping 80 to 81 countries. I keep saying 81 because that's India is the big one, you know. Basically dramatically increase their investment in technology, in greening the economy, in weaning themselves off of Chinese-financed, very low-cost new coal. There's 112 gigawatts of new coal coming online that hasn't even been built yet, that we have to replace with other types of technologies. And it's investing in a new technology frontier, including nuclear, that can make that possible. And I think if we don't do that, you'll see a big bifurcation where the wealthier part of the world creates jobs, greens its economy, does it slowly or quickly, but does it, and the rest of the world becomes the source of 70, 80% of the world's carbon emissions.
It must be frustrating for you, given what you were describing. You go to these countries, they're desperately needy, they have this debt, and then you notice that the political class is siphoning off huge amounts of money, and, you know, to bank accounts in Switzerland. I mean, if you look at a country like Nigeria, you know, the estimate is that $500 billion has been transferred into essentially, metaphorically, Swiss bank accounts. I remember you, I'm sure you're not going to want to say the name, but you told me a story about a very big project that you were proposing in an African country. And with Obama in the room, the leader of the country comes up to you and says, by the way, here's the bank account that I want you to send X million dollars, otherwise this project doesn't go through. I mean, that to me must be the most dispiriting part, to see the state of these societies and then these people who are living like billionaires, who are multi-billionaires.
Well, one of my chapters is called Know Who You're Betting On, because big bets, and I've learned this in part because of the story you mentioned, the hard way, but big bets require really assessing people and understanding who cares about their own people. And I think it is true that if a leader doesn't fundamentally see themselves as a leader of people, trying to lift up people, and just sees themselves as trying to profit from the position they have, and they certainly exist, you're very stuck. You can do some things, HIV programs, vaccinations, things like that, but big industrial development, greening an economy, those things become virtually impossible. The good news is, though, actually there are plenty of leaders who are not like that, you know. And even though in the last, frankly, since 2015, I mean, since President Trump was elected here in America during that first term, changed the way we talked about anti-corruption and values around the world, and we saw some backsliding. But apart from that backsliding over the last 6 to 8 years, there's been a pretty steady drumbeat over 30 years towards less corruption, more transparency, and more democratic governance everywhere in the world. And so there are obviously some big countries you got to keep an eye on, but I think there's still plenty of opportunity to work with people. And by the way, our biggest projects we announced 1,400 mini grids, these solar grids that'll cover almost 25% of the population of Zambia, and provide electrification connected to agriculture that'll increase incomes for farmers and the like. President Hichilema is a democratically elected president trying to do the right thing, trying to deliver results for his people before the next election. And I get optimistic because they call us and they say, how can you help us? We see what you're doing in India. How can you do this here and do it within 18 months? And there are folks in the room on these teams that they drop everything, they go to Zambia, they make these things happen, and the next thing you know, you're rolling on some big, huge initiative that's going to change a lot of lives. So again, it doesn't get as much attention, but it's easy for me to be optimistic because I'm surrounded by the solutions to these problems. Even the debt problem, you know, we have a team, right now as we speak is the Marrakesh meeting of the World Bank and the IMF. And it's been Rockefeller and Open Society Institute and Gates, this group of foundations working with Mia Mottley, the Prime Minister of Barbados, 2 years ago started to construct a really creative approach to generating another $200 billion of financing for countries by leveraging the balance sheets of the development banks more aggressively. These innovations are everywhere if you nurture them, if you look for them, if you bring them up, and then if you're willing to do the political work to make sure people have to deal with them, when they're making decisions.
So, most people look at the world and they're always hearing about the new, everything that's wrong, everything that's going badly, all the problem you described, the situation, global warming, very accurately, was very dispiriting. Yet you seem very optimistic. Is that a temperamental thing? What do you think?
Well, it's definitely temperamental. It's also part of the job. It's also, what's the alternative? Are we just going to walk around and be like, oh my gosh, we're all doomed? I mean, the truth is, it's we get to be a part of these institutions. You have such a powerful voice that when you offer solutions, people get excited about, they see a diplomatic path when otherwise they see war and conflict. Being an optimist, if you've studied an issue and you know what you're talking about, can help others really be optimistic about the future. And I'm surrounded by big bets that we get to make. Some of these we've announced, some we're going to do in the years to come, but school feeding is another one. There's 700 million kids in schools around the world, and about half of them get a school lunch, and most of them don't get any real nutrition in their school lunch. And we're building a big coalition to change that. And if I went through the numbers, you'd be shocked at how inexpensive it is and how straightforward it could be to simply get every child on the planet a nutritious school lunch. And I think we're going to get that done. We're going to launch that sometime next year. I'm getting ahead of my board. But, so I feel like if your day job is being surrounded by people who have these ideas and partners who want to do this, it's easy to be optimistic.
A number of the questions, and it's interesting to me that this is what is on your minds, are about dysfunction, polarization, deadlock, division in Washington. It's probably less true for you in your current job, but at USAID, how much did that impede your work? How much does that, dispirit you when you think about it, just partly as a citizen?
Well, there's a story, I write a chapter in the book that I call Make It Personal, because it was a lesson I learned when we were trying to launch this big global effort to fight hunger and extreme poverty, coming out of the 2008 food, fuel, and financial crisis that left 100 million people pushed back under the hunger poverty line. And that was a moment, by the way, when the cover of The Economist had a young girl in Haiti eating a mud cake, which is actually cereal grain mixed with mud, so she could have more satiety. And so we launched all these programs. They were sort of working okay, and they were just getting started and going forward. And then we lost the House in 2010, right? In 2011. 2011. And the first bill by Speaker Boehner and Paul Ryan, who's the Budget Committee chair, was called H.R. 1, and it zeroed out USAID. Basically just said, we don't need it. It came from the Freedom Caucus, which tells you something about the moment we're in now. But it said, we don't need this giving money abroad thing. Let's just take it to zero. So I had my team, kind of Gates Foundation style, do all the math. And I went to Congress and I testified. And I said, this bill, this Republican budget will kill 70,000 kids. And I detailed malaria programs, HIV programs, immunization programs. And I got back to my office, and I was kind of congratulated by folks at the White House and elsewhere for being tough. And then Tom Vilsack called me. And he said, Raj, I was just with Speaker Boehner, and he's very upset with you because there is a deep, faith-based, conservative part of our politics that has supported America's humanitarian leadership around the world for decades. And he works hard to nurture that, and he felt your comments were insensitive and unaware. So I went, he's like, you gotta go see him. So I went to see him. I apologized for the way I projected my data. And he gave me a list, and he said, look, if you really want to get this stuff done, you have to stop beating up on people in public, and here's 30 people to go really get to know. And
who's all congressmen?
All members of Congress and the Senate. Barry Jackson was his chief of staff who made the list for me, and I started on a project to do that. And I got to know some incredible people that I never thought would become authentic friends. One was Jim Inhofe, the senator from Oklahoma, who once took a snowball onto the floor of the US Senate to show climate change was not so serious because it was cold out. But I'll tell you, Senator Inhofe we got to know each other. I got to learn that he had adopted a wonderful young girl from Ethiopia, that he had a passion for fighting hunger, especially in Africa. We traveled together. Once famously got stuck in the mud in a van together, and he said, "Okay, everybody under 70, get out and push." He thought that was really funny. We actually had to do that, but
I assume he was 71.
he was 72 at the time, I think. But the point is, we prayed together. We got to know, like, a lot of their commitment to these issues came from their faith. And even though I'm Hindu by background, they were like, look, you have the same concepts that underlie your faith tradition. He invited me to the Senate prayer breakfast, and ultimately I gave the keynote address at the National Prayer Breakfast one year, and at Senator Inhofe's invitation. And you know, what I learned from all that was, if you put the time in to get to know people and build authentic relationships, even if you don't agree on most things, you can get a lot done. And we ended up passing the Global Food Security Act, which was only the second largest piece of global development legislation after PEPFAR since World War II, since the creation of USAID and the Marshall Plan and all that. And it's been reauthorized twice. It was used most recently around the Black Sea Grain Initiative to protect the flow of food from Ukraine into humanitarian sources and systems. And it's made a huge impact. My estimate is that that act has helped the US and other countries lift as much as 100 million people out of hunger sustainably. And I think it's possible to do these things, but only if you're willing to do the really personal political work. So your answer is a long answer to your question, but I hope more people learn either the easy way or the hard way. I learned the hard way, that time spent actually getting to know people in surprising ways, in personal ways, and in vulnerable ways is sort of critical to building the kind of politics that can sustain this point of view.
It's interesting that your answer has so much to do with the personal relationships, because I remember talking to Bill Clinton about this once, and he said that he thought one of the most deleterious, damaging changes that had taken place in the political culture in Washington was that fundraising had become so ubiquitous that nobody lived in Washington anymore. That when he first got to it, it really changed during his presidency. And he said when he got there, the culture in Washington was people lived in Washington. They sent their kids to school in Washington. And as a result, Republicans and Democrats would meet at PTA meetings, at the kids' Little League games, at the school theater performance. And at the end of the day, there's only so much you can vilify someone when your 7-year-old girl is in love with his 7-year-old boy, right? And he said what changed was now everybody lives in their home districts. They fly into Washington. They live like in school dorm situations where they share houses, because all they're doing is they're coming in for a day or two a week to cast the votes they need to, and then off they are fundraising again. And that has completely changed the culture of Washington. These people don't actually know each other.
Yeah, that was my experience. I mean, when I testified and gave that testimony, there were all these headlines about the 70,000 kids, and all of a sudden I was invited on cable news shows and the evening news shows. And as the USAID administrator, unless there's an earthquake or a pandemic, you're not usually you don't usually get that invitation. So you would get that reward just to go on and beat folks up even more, but that would have had the opposite intention. And to be clear, it was hard. It was actually hard for me to go get to know folks, and you'd hear things you didn't agree with, and you'd sort of try to put it in perspective. And it's not easy. And it does require being open and vulnerable in a personal way that I think, if at least my mindset was, well, if I don't have to do that, why would I do that? Yeah. But in the end, I left that role with a strong set of friendships on the Republican side that I really genuinely cherished, and I learned a lot from them, and I think we also got a lot done together.
All right, so you've run the largest foreign aid program in the history of the world. You're running one of the largest foundations in the world. How do you top this? What is the future for Raj Shah hold?
I don't know. Right now, I love being at the Rockefeller Foundation because it is, and it's not just our foundation. There are many other places that get to do this. We really get to be a platform to bring together the smartest people to solve the toughest problems, and that's very, very special. Our view is we can have the most impact only by working with others and only by working with governments. So we do a lot of advocacy and a lot of policy, and I love policy advocacy and public service, and I see it all as sort of one big thing. So no big future insights, who knows? Every time I've predicted my future, I've been incredibly wrong. I joined a presidential campaign to get a White House job, we lost. You know, I went to med school to be a doctor, I was gonna be a pediatrician, that didn't happen. Early on, I started in college in engineering, wanting to be an auto designer, and my auto designs were very akin to what you'd call the Tesla Model S. So I might have missed out on a big opportunity, but that didn't pan out either, so we'll see.
Well, I think you've done all right, and I think more importantly, you know, I really mean this. It's so profoundly satisfying, and it gives one so much pride as an American to see somebody like you who's gone into public service and who is helping the world become a better place. So thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Fareed. And we know this, but we all feel the same way about you. So thank you.
Raj, thank you. He's going to sign your books and answer personal questions that you might have after this.
Thank you.
The two go together.